Hello and welcome to RC's Rail Fanning Productions. Today is May 4th, 2025, and today we are on the Arcade and Attica Railroad. Today, Timeless Rail Expeditions and Dynamo Productions co-operated a photo charter with Arcade and Attica 18. For many people, this was their first time experiencing Arcade and Attica 18 under steam, including myself. To put it into perspective, it's a little engine, but it packs one hell of a punch. Currently, the 18 is backing up from the first photo run by. We started the day over Cattaraugus Creek in Arcade, and we traveled our way along the main line between Arcade and Couriers, New York. Before we get started, I'd like to thank all of the guys from Dynamo Productions and Timeless Rail Expeditions that made this possible, along with the Arcade and Attica Railroad. Today was a phenomenal day packed with steam-powered action, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the return of Arcade and Attica under steam, and may the 4th be with you. Before we return to the steam action, we have a little run-by with Arcade and Attica 114, an RS3 locomotive. Today, the RS3 will be pulling the passenger consist for the first part of the afternoon, while the Arcade and Attica 18 pulled the freight consist. Here we have a quick run-by over the Cattaraugus Creek as the train comes to pick up the passengers. Moving further up the line, we find ourselves on the former grounds of the Hummingbird Toy Company. In the recent months, the once large Hummingbird Toy Company came to its final end in Arcade, where it was torn down. In the Hummingbird Toy Company's prime, they produced yo-yos for small children. The toy company went through many ups and downs in its long career. However, it took its final blow in 1989 when a flood hit the toy company and devastated the entire building, forcing them to move out. However, with its location, it was not worth it to restore the building, and this is what it looked like from 1989 to 2025. With 3.5 inches of rain flooding the toy company, more than 70,000 yo-yos flowed from the company to the Cattaraugus Creek, and it was reported that yo-yos had been flowing down Cattaraugus Creek for well over a month. However, that was all for the Hummingbird Toy Company, as they were not able to come back after such a loss. And just a few weeks ago, the Hummingbird Toy Company took its final end with the demolition in early 2025. However, on a more positive note, here we have our second run-by of the day, just north of Cattaraugus Creek. As you can tell by the rain on the screen, I went through quite a few lens wipes today. Now, the 114 would do a quick little run-by before the passengers were to board the train and go to the Y in Arcade. In between the Y and Arcade, there's a little hill that is perfect for photography of the trains going by. We'd get a little bit of a glimpse of the 114 as it shoves back, and as the 18 goes by, where it would then perform 3 run-bys by the Y. The arcade in Attica 18 was purchased in 1962 from the Point City Railroad in Michigan, along with two Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western coaches. It was purchased in the trying times of the Arcade and Attica Railroad as the freight business had gone down. But the 1920 280 American Locomotive Company engine was perfect for the Arcade and Attica, as in August of that season, in only 27 days, 17,000 paying passengers were carried in only the two cars that they had purchased. In 1963, they also purchased engine number 14, a Baldwin 460, from the Escanaba and Lake Superior Railroad, and a few more of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western coaches. The line came to be known as the Grand Scenic Route thanks to 18 and 14, and it's a joy to see engine number 18 back in service. After 3 very entertaining run-bys with the 18, especially the last one with the cylinder cocks completely open, we now have a brief run-by with the 114, the former Western New York and Pennsylvania RS3, number 406. Here they would pick us up and take us further down the line towards the Arcade Junction, where there is a grain mill in the back, which made for a very nice photo. After a brief ride up the line, we find ourselves just east of Arcade Junction. Arcade Junction is where the Arcade and Attica Railroad interchanges with the Buffalo-Pittsburgh Railroad. There they interchange all sorts of freight traffic, especially grain traffic, as the main customer on the A&A line is the Reisdorf Brothers feed mill. The Reisdorf Brothers is some 14 miles up the line from here. However, the Arcade in Attica is always busy serving grain cars to the Reisdorf Brothers. For a matter of fact, the A&A was so busy with the grain mill that they had to purchase the Arcade in Attica 114, the Alco RS3 locomotive, as the center cab locomotive could no longer handle the weight of having to pull so much freight up the line, and it was getting inefficient to run 2 center cabs with 2 crews, as they cannot MU the locomotives together. So, with 114 on the property, they were able to carry higher loads of freight with less power. At this point in the day, we were ahead enough of schedule that we were able to perform 3 run-bys here. Each time we got a unique angle of the 18 as it passes through at track speed. I wasn't able to find much information about the grain elevator that you see in the shot here, except that it was at one time part of the Agway grain mill. Now it is merely a memory, but still stands the test of time. This and the Hummingbird Point Company are two of the most popular spots to film the train in Arcade, New York. After the third run-by, we would get a quick run-by of the diesel, and we would take a little bit of break where the engine was filled with water and they exchanged cars. Fortunately for us, while the locomotive was being filled with water, the water from the sky decided to come down, so we didn't get our cameras too wet on Sunday. However, we still had some misty stuff in the air. We did mess up a few shots, but nonetheless, we still had a great time. Here we see 114 pulling the freight consist around and heading to the Empire siding, where they would swap ends of the locomotive for a scene later down the road. Afterwards, ANA 18 would pass by the coaches and then hook onto the coaches and they would roll to Courier's Field.
Sorry about that. You got it.
Here around 3 o'clock, our train departed the arcade depot for Courier's, New York. say the least, riding directly behind a steam locomotive for the first time in my life was one hell of an experience, and this little steamer put on one hell of a show. Here in the small town of Couriers, we see the A&A's siding where trains meet or locomotives swap ends on the typical excursions. Inside the depot is a model setup, some snacks, restrooms, the typical stuff you'd find in a depot. Here in Couriers, we'd have a couple of old cars stationed, including a T-Bird, and we would have a few actors. Special thank you to all of those who acted in a few of our scenes. We had a departing scene, we had a couple of run-bys, and a few static poses. Again, thanks to everyone who made this happen. Additionally, Patrick Connors Sr. and son, Patrick Connors Jr., dressed up as conductors for today's run and posed in many of our photos along the way. Special thanks to the both of them as well for operating on today's trip.
Our next photo runway was about a quarter-mile to the west of Couriers, New York, in the middle of the woods. Thank you to the property owner who let us be on his property in order to film the A-18. Many tourist railroads and other short-line railroads of the 21st century were formed from bigger main lines or larger rail connections, or just prior railroads that no longer exist. However, the Arcade and Attica Railroad is very unique in the sense that it has always been the Arcade and Attica Railroad since the 1800s. The story begins as railroads were stretching across the country. The farmers of western New York saw the perfect opportunity for a link to the big cities. Many small organizations formed that began building railroads throughout the countryside. Despite many stops and starts, railroads were being stretched across the picturesque Allegheny River Valley. When the Pennsylvania Railroad wanted to connect Buffalo, they found the best way to do so would be to purchase all the smaller incomplete railroads and link them together. As a result, the Buffalo, Arcade, and Attica Railroad was formed. The narrow gauge line would connect Attica through Arcade to the Pennsylvania state line, then on to Pittsburgh. In 1880, the line officially opened between Attica and Couriers Corners, where the excursion stops to this day. The rails that you see today were the first spiked down in 1881 and standardized in 1895 to connect with the Pennsylvania Railroad. By 1917, the Buffalo, Arcade, and Attica Railroad was being operated by the Buffalo and Susquehanna Railroad, which was thinking of closing down this section of the line. The businessmen along the Buffalo, Arcade, and Attica were very concerned. The Merrill Sewell Company of Arcade, which is the predecessor of the Borden Company, operated a large milk processing plant, and they, along with others, needed rail service. Facing closure, interested parties began to raise money needed to purchase this section of the line. Stock was sold to farmers, merchants, and anyone else who was interested. As a result, 365 people raised $79,000 and formed the Arcade and Attica Railroad Corporation. And the story begins. The small corporation still owns the railroad today. This railroad, however, has never been blessed with a lot of luck. In addition to many bankruptcies, numerous washouts have taken the toll on the small railroad. The largest of these washouts occurred in January of 1957 when the Tawana Creek River flooded its banks, taking several hundred feet of track with it. At that time, it would have cost around $72,000 to repair the damage, which is an amount that the stockholders could not afford. In an emergency session at the Board of Directors, they voted to suspend all operations between North Java and Attica on January 25th of that year. Nearly all of the freight business was between Arcade and North Java anyway, so it wasn't much of a difficult decision. Permission was granted from the ICC and the line from North Java to Attica was abandoned. The freight railroad had an active freight service which transported milk, cheese, grain, cattle, gasoline, coal, and mail. 13 boxcars were purchased especially for carrying ceremona all over the nation while the Arcade Borden plan was in operation. The longest train ever operated by the A&A occurred in the 1920s when the line handled 50 cars of new, improved Michigan limestone out of Attica. With engine number 5 in the lead, cars were set off at each station along the way until the train arrived at Arcade with 2 engines and 25 cars. The conductor on this special was Gus Burwanger, engineer Simon Kilton, and Rube Robley, fireman. One of the more interesting operations of the railroad was service to the Attica State Prison. The Erie Railroad serviced that area, but their engines were too big to get inside of the prison, so the job came to the A&A with its smaller engines. No extra passengers ever took the train out of the prison due to the watchful eyes of the guards. The 1930s were the boom years for the A&A, so when the Depression hit, they were able to stay afloat without laying off a single employee. Quite a record. In 1941, with the advent of the diesel locomotive and the need to reduce expenses, the railroad purchased number 110, a 44-ton General Electric diesel engine. The A&A became one of the very first railroads in the nation to conduct operations with diesel power. Number 110, the first new locomotive ever owned by the company, performed so well and cut expenses so drastically that it literally saved the Arcade in Attica. In 1941, it became famous, becoming the subject of numerous ads in the trade papers. However, in the late 1950s, post-World War II, the freight business began to slide, and something had to be done in order to save the short line. The decision was made to try steam-powered passenger excursions. And number 18, a 1920 280 consolidation type American Locomotive Company engine, was purchased in 1962 from the Boyne City Railroad in Michigan with 2 Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western coaches. Its inaugural run was on July 27, 1962, to railroad officials and the press. The regular service summertime excursions began in August of the same year. During that first season of over 27 days, 17,000 paying passengers were carried in only 2 cars. The trains ran from morning to night. In 1963, number 14, a Baldwin 260 was purchased from the Escanaba and Lake Superior Railroad, with more DL and W coaches. The line became to be known as the Grand Scenic Route.
That's fine. I appreciate it.
Today, the A&A still has freight operations in North Java, New York, and it has its passenger operations between Couriers and Arcade. At our next spot here at the Empire Siding, which is just east of Arcade, we have the meet scene between 114 and 18. Enjoy the faster run by as it goes track speed. For the final daylight run-by, we were stationed at the Arcade Volunteer Fire Department. Here, the train would pass us at track speed. Additionally, Curtis Huey and his girlfriend Madeline were the actors, and Curtis brought his T-Bird car to add to the shot. After a few nighttime exposures of the 18 over the Cattaraugus Creek Bridge, we now did a couple of night photo run-bys. alas, we've come to the final shot of the day. I want to once again thank everyone who made this day happen, and to see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed.